The sound of my uncle's voice cracking as he pleaded with his boss for early payment echoed through the thin walls of the construction trailer like a prayer being answered with silence. I had come to the job site to bring Uncle James lunch, the same peanut butter sandwiches he had been eating for 3 weeks because his family couldn't afford anything else. But I found him in the worst situation I had ever witnessed. A 42-year-old man with calloused hands and a bent back, literally begging his employer for money he had already earned through 20 years of backbreaking labor. "Mr. Peterson," I heard Uncle James say through the trailer wall, his voice carrying the kind of desperation that comes when dignity becomes a luxury you can't afford. "I know payday isn't until Friday, but my kids haven't had a real meal in 4 days. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for my wages from last week. I earned that money." The response from Peterson was everything wrong with American capitalism, condensed into a single, dismissive sentence. "James, you know company policy. Payroll runs on Fridays. If you can't manage your money between paychecks, that's not my problem." But it was Peterson's problem, because he had been deliberately delaying paychecks for months, using his workers' desperation as leverage to keep them compliant, grateful, and too afraid of unemployment to demand better treatment. He knew that men like Uncle James, men with families to feed and bills to pay, would endure almost any humiliation rather than risk losing jobs that barely paid enough for survival. Standing outside that trailer, listening to my uncle's dignity being systematically destroyed by a man who made more in a week than Uncle James made in 3 months, I felt something change inside me that would never change back. Watching my uncle, a man who had worked with his hands for 20 years, reduced to begging for money he had already earned, I made a choice that would change everything. My name is Damon Williams, and my Uncle James was the hardest working man I had ever known. At 42, he had been in construction since he was 18, starting as a laborer and working his way up to foreman through skill, reliability, and the kind of work ethic that believed every job was worth doing right the first time. Uncle James had been my role model since childhood, the man who taught me to use tools, to build things with my hands, to understand that honest work was something to be proud of, regardless of how much it paid. He had raised 3 children as a single father after his wife died in a car accident 5 years earlier, somehow managing to keep his family together while working 60-hour weeks and never missing a school play, parent conference, or soccer game. His children, my cousins Michael, aged 14, Sarah, aged 12, and little Tony, aged 8, were some of the most polite, responsible kids I knew, raised by a father who had taught them that character mattered more than money, that family loyalty was more important than individual success, and that working people deserved respect for their contributions to society. Uncle James lived by principles that seemed increasingly outdated in an economy that treated workers as replaceable parts rather than human beings with families and dreams. He believed that if you showed up on time, worked hard, and did quality work, your employer would treat you fairly. He believed that loyalty and dedication would be rewarded with job security and steady pay. He believed that in America, honest work would provide a path to modest prosperity and dignity. But Uncle James worked for Peterson Construction, a company that specialized in residential developments and commercial projects throughout our region. Peterson had built his business by underbidding competitors, which he accomplished by paying workers as little as possible while extracting maximum labor through a combination of overtime requirements and constant threats of replacement. The Peterson construction business model depended on keeping workers desperate. Paychecks were often delayed by several days or a week, creating cash flow problems that forced workers to ask for advances or early payments that Peterson could grant or deny based on how compliant employees had been. Health insurance was minimal and expensive. There were no paid sick days, no vacation time, and no retirement contributions. Workers who complained about conditions or asked for raises were reminded that unemployment in our area was high, that construction jobs were competitive, and that Peterson could always find someone willing to work for less money with fewer complaints. The threat of replacement was constant and effective because workers with families couldn't afford to call Peterson's bluff. Uncle James had been trapped in this system for 8 years, ever since the construction company he had worked for previously went out of business during the 2008 recession. He had tried to find other employment, but most construction companies in our area operated similarly, and at 42, he was considered too old for many employers who preferred younger workers they could pay less and work harder. The specific crisis that had led to Uncle James begging for early payment was a combination of circumstances that demonstrated how quickly financial stability could collapse for working families. Tony had gotten sick and required a doctor's visit that cost $180 after insurance. Sarah needed school supplies and fees for activities that totaled $95. The family's car had needed repairs that cost $240, and their rent had been increased by $75 per month. These weren't luxuries or poor financial decisions. They were the basic expenses of raising a family, the costs that every parent faces, but that become impossible to manage when paychecks are delayed and wages are inadequate. Uncle James had been forced to choose between paying bills on time and buying groceries, between keeping the lights on and putting gas in his car to get to work. The mathematical reality was simple and brutal. Uncle James earned approximately $2,800 per month before taxes, which left him with roughly $2,200 in take-home pay. His monthly expenses, rent, utilities, car payment, insurance, groceries, and basic necessities for 3 children totaled approximately $2,400. Even without unexpected costs like medical bills or car repairs, his income was insufficient to provide basic security for his family. But the deeper problem wasn't just money, it was dignity. Uncle James was a skilled foreman whose expertise and leadership were essential to Peterson's business success. He managed construction crews, solved complex technical problems, and ensured that projects were completed on time and to specification. His knowledge and experience generated far more value for Peterson Construction than he received in wages. Have you ever watched someone you respect beg for money they've already earned? When you realize that working hard doesn't guarantee basic human dignity, that skill and dedication don't protect you from exploitation, that the system rewards people who own things more than people who build things. That's where I found myself at 18, standing outside a construction trailer and understanding for the first time that Uncle James's situation wasn't the result of personal failures or bad choices, but the predictable outcome of economic systems designed to extract maximum value from workers while providing minimum compensation and security. The systematic exploitation that Uncle James experienced at Peterson Construction wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate business strategy designed to maximize profits by minimizing labor costs and worker power. Peterson had created conditions that kept his employees financially desperate and therefore unable to demand better treatment or seek alternative employment. The delayed paycheck strategy was particularly effective because it created artificial cash flow crises that forced workers to ask for favors rather than demand rights. When paychecks were delayed, workers couldn't pay bills on time, which created late fees and damaged credit scores. They were forced to ask Peterson for advances or early payments, which put them in the position of supplicants rather than employees who had earned their wages. Peterson used these requests for early payment as opportunities to remind workers that their employment was conditional on his goodwill rather than their performance. He would grant or deny requests based on how compliant workers had been, how willing they were to work overtime without complaint, and how much leverage he wanted to maintain over their personal finances. The health insurance offered through Peterson Construction was designed to appear beneficial while providing minimal actual coverage. High deductibles meant that workers paid out of pocket for most medical expenses, and the premiums consumed a significant portion of their take-home pay. Workers were essentially paying for the privilege of having insurance that didn't cover the medical expenses they actually incurred. The lack of paid sick leave created additional pressure on workers to come to work even when they were ill, which reduced productivity and created safety hazards on construction sites. Workers who took time off for illness or family emergencies lost pay and faced questions about their commitment to their jobs. The overtime requirements were structured to benefit Peterson while exhausting his workers. Overtime pay was calculated in ways that minimized the premium payments while extending work weeks to 60 or 70 hours. Workers were required to work overtime, but weren't guaranteed consistent overtime hours, making it impossible to budget for the additional income. The constant threat of replacement was perhaps the most effective tool for maintaining worker compliance. Peterson would regularly remind employees that unemployment was high, that younger workers were available for less money, and that loyalty to the company was the only thing protecting their jobs. He created an environment where workers felt grateful for exploitation rather than angry about inadequate compensation. But the most insidious aspect of Peterson's business model was how it isolated workers from each other. Employees were discouraged from discussing wages, comparing treatment, or organizing for better conditions. Peterson promoted competition between workers rather than solidarity, offering small bonuses or temporary benefits to employees who demonstrated exceptional loyalty while withholding similar rewards from others. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed to keep people like my uncle desperate and dependent. The impact of Uncle James's exploitation extended far beyond his personal financial struggles into every aspect of his family's life and future prospects. His children were learning that work didn't provide security, that adults could be humiliated by employers, and that economic vulnerability was a permanent condition rather than a temporary challenge. Michael, at 14, had started working part-time jobs after school to help with family expenses instead of focusing on academics that could prepare him for college. His grades were suffering because he was tired from work and stressed about his family's financial situation. The teenager who should have been thinking about his future was instead worried about immediate survival. Sarah, at 12, had become the family's primary caretaker for her younger brother because Uncle James worked such long hours and couldn't afford childcare. She was missing extracurricular activities and social opportunities that were important for her development, taking on adult responsibilities that were affecting her childhood and education. Little Tony, at 8, didn't fully understand why there wasn't always food in the refrigerator or why his father seemed tired and worried all the time, but he was learning that life was uncertain and that adults couldn't always provide basic security. The foundation of trust and safety that children need for healthy development was being eroded by economic instability. The family's social connections were being damaged by their inability to participate in community activities that required money. Birthday parties, school events, and family gatherings became sources of shame rather than joy because Uncle James couldn't afford the gifts, fees, or transportation costs that participation required. Uncle James himself was showing signs of the chronic stress that comes from prolonged economic insecurity. His health was suffering from long work hours, poor nutrition, and the constant anxiety of not knowing whether he would be able to meet his family's basic needs. He had developed back problems from years of physical labor, but he couldn't afford to take time off for proper medical treatment. The psychological impact was perhaps even more damaging than the physical effects. Uncle James was beginning to internalize the message that his work wasn't valuable, that his needs didn't matter, that he deserved the treatment he was receiving from Peterson. His self-esteem was being systematically destroyed by employment that required him to be grateful for exploitation. The broader community was also affected by the way Peterson Construction operated. Workers who were barely surviving on inadequate wages couldn't contribute to the local economy through consumer spending. Children whose parents worked for Peterson were more likely to struggle in school and less likely to pursue higher education. The cycle of poverty was being perpetuated through employment practices that prevented workers from building economic security or investing in their families' futures. But the most heartbreaking aspect of Uncle James's situation was watching him blame himself for circumstances that were beyond his control. He believed that if he worked harder, complained less, or somehow proved his value more effectively, Peterson would treat him fairly. He didn't understand that Peterson's business model depended on worker desperation and that no amount of individual effort could overcome systematic exploitation. That night, I realized I had two choices: watch my uncle's spirit die slowly, or do something that would either save him or destroy me trying. The research phase that followed was my education in the economic realities that had trapped Uncle James and millions of other American workers in cycles of exploitation and poverty. I spent weeks studying labor laws, wage theft statistics, and the business models that companies like Peterson Construction use to extract maximum value from workers while avoiding legal accountability. What I discovered was that Uncle James's situation wasn't unique, it was epidemic. Wage theft, the practice of employers withholding wages that workers have earned, costs American workers an estimated $50 billion annually. Construction workers are particularly vulnerable because they often work for small companies that operate with minimal oversight and can disappear if workers attempt to file complaints. The delayed paycheck strategy that Peterson used was technically legal as long as workers were eventually paid, but it created financial hardships that were designed to keep workers dependent and compliant. Many states had laws requiring prompt payment of wages, but enforcement was minimal and penalties were insufficient to deter violations. The health insurance and benefits packages offered by companies like Peterson Construction were often structured to appear competitive while providing minimal actual value. High deductibles, limited coverage, and expensive premiums meant that workers paid significant amounts for insurance that didn't protect them from financial hardship due to medical expenses. The overtime requirements that Peterson imposed were legal under federal labor laws, but they created working conditions that were unsustainable for workers with families. The combination of long hours and inadequate base wages meant that workers needed overtime to survive, but the physical and emotional demands of 60-hour work weeks made it impossible to maintain health and family relationships. The threat of replacement that Peterson used to control his workers was effective because it reflected real economic conditions in many communities. High unemployment, particularly in industries like construction that had been affected by economic downturns, created labor markets where employers had significant power to dictate terms of employment. But I also learned about successful challenges to exploitative employment practices. Worker cooperatives, labor unions, and alternative business models had created examples of how construction companies could operate profitably while treating workers fairly. The key was creating economic alternatives that gave workers choices rather than forcing them to accept whatever employment was available. The legal remedies available to workers like Uncle James were limited and often ineffective. Filing complaints with labor departments required documentation that workers rarely had access to, involved processes that could take months or years, and often resulted in minimal penalties that didn't compensate workers for lost wages or change employer behavior. Class action lawsuits had been successful in some cases, but they required coordination between workers who were often afraid of retaliation, legal expertise that was expensive, and evidence that companies like Peterson Construction were careful not to create in obvious ways. Individual legal action was rarely viable for workers earning survival wages because legal fees exceeded potential recovery amounts, and the time required for litigation created additional financial hardships that workers couldn't afford. But the most important thing I learned was that the most effective responses to systematic exploitation weren't legal or regulatory. They were economic. Creating alternative employment opportunities, developing worker-owned businesses, and building economic models that shared profits with workers rather than extracting them had proven more effective than attempting to reform exploitative companies. I learned that my uncle's situation wasn't unique. It was epidemic, and fighting it would require strategy, not just anger. The initial impulse toward illegal solutions felt both natural and justified, given the systematic nature of Uncle James's exploitation. Peterson was stealing wages, destroying lives, and treating workers as disposable resources rather than human beings. The idea of responding with theft, sabotage, or violence seemed like proportional justice rather than criminal behavior. I researched ways to damage Peterson's business that would be difficult to trace back to me or Uncle James. Sabotaging equipment would create costs and delays that would reduce Peterson's profits. Stealing tools or materials would force him to absorb replacement costs. Vandalizing completed projects would damage his reputation and create legal liabilities. The more serious options I considered included exposing Peterson to regulatory violations that could result in fines or license suspension, anonymously reporting safety violations that could shut down job sites, or creating evidence of tax evasion or other illegal practices that could result in criminal charges. But the most tempting option was simply taking the money that Peterson owed Uncle James and other workers. Peterson often had cash on construction sites for materials and subcontractor payments. The amount he was withholding from workers would have been easy to identify and steal, and it would have felt like recovering stolen property rather than committing theft. I spent hours planning scenarios that would allow me to hurt Peterson's business while protecting Uncle James from retaliation. Anonymous complaints, untraceable sabotage, and carefully orchestrated incidents that would create maximum financial damage with minimal risk of discovery. But as I developed these plans, I realized that revenge wouldn't solve Uncle James's fundamental problem. Even if I successfully damaged Peterson's business, Uncle James would still be trapped in an economic system that required him to work for exploitative employers. Destroying one bad boss wouldn't create the economic alternatives that Uncle James needed to build a secure life for his family. More importantly, I began to understand that illegal responses to systematic problems often perpetuated the cycles they were intended to disrupt. Violence and criminal behavior reinforced narratives that workers were dangerous and deserved harsh treatment. Theft and sabotage provided justification for increased surveillance and control over workers. The most effective resistance to exploitation wasn't destruction, it was creation. Building economic alternatives that demonstrated better ways of organizing work and sharing profits. Proving that businesses could be successful while treating workers fairly. Creating choices for people like Uncle James that allowed them to leave exploitative employment rather than endure it. I had found ways to hurt his boss, but I realized that revenge wouldn't rebuild my uncle's dignity. Only success would. The revolutionary choice that emerged from my research wasn't about fighting Peterson Construction directly, but about making Peterson Construction irrelevant by creating better alternatives. Instead of trying to reform an exploitative system, I would build a competing system that treated workers as partners rather than resources. The idea that began forming was ambitious and unprecedented. Start a construction company owned and operated by the workers themselves, where profits were shared equally, where wages were paid promptly and fairly, and where employment provided dignity and security rather than exploitation and desperation. Worker-owned cooperatives existed in other industries and regions, but they were rare in construction, particularly in our area where traditional business models dominated. Creating a successful cooperative would require not just business skills and capital, but also the ability to convince workers who had been conditioned to accept exploitation that alternatives were possible. The business model I developed was designed to address every aspect of worker exploitation that I had observed at Peterson Construction. Workers would be paid immediately upon completion of each day's work, eliminating the cash flow problems that Peterson created through delayed paychecks. Health insurance would be provided through group purchasing that reduced costs while improving coverage. Overtime would be voluntary and fairly compensated, with profits shared among all worker owners rather than extracted by outside investors. But the most important element was democratic decision-making that gave workers control over their working conditions, their compensation, and their future. Instead of being subject to the arbitrary decisions of employers like Peterson, workers would collectively determine how their business operated and how profits were distributed. The challenge was proving that such a model could be financially viable while competing against companies that kept costs low through worker exploitation. The cooperative would need to demonstrate superior quality, reliability, and customer service that justified competitive pricing while providing workers with fair compensation. I spent 2 weeks developing a comprehensive business plan that addressed every aspect of starting and operating a worker-owned construction cooperative. The plan included financial projections, marketing strategies, legal structures, and operational procedures that would allow the cooperative to compete successfully while maintaining its commitment to worker ownership and democratic management. But the most critical element was assembling a team of workers who were willing to take the risk of leaving secure employment, even exploitative employment, to attempt something that had never been tried in our community. The cooperative would need experienced workers who could handle complex projects, reliable workers who could build the reputation necessary for business success, and committed workers who shared the vision of creating dignity through economic empowerment. Instead of tearing down what oppressed us, I decided to build something that would make oppression irrelevant. The 72-hour sprint to turn the cooperative concept into reality became the most intense learning experience of my life. I had to master business registration procedures, insurance requirements, licensing regulations, and financial structures that I had never encountered before. Every hour was spent either learning new skills or applying them to concrete tasks that moved the cooperative closer to operational status. The first challenge was legal structure. Creating a worker-owned cooperative required filing articles of incorporation that were different from traditional business structures, establishing bylaws that governed democratic decision-making, and developing membership agreements that defined worker ownership rights and responsibilities. I contacted lawyers who specialized in cooperative law, researched successful models from other regions, and drafted documents that could be filed immediately to establish the legal foundation for the business. The legal costs were higher than I had anticipated, but they were essential for creating a legitimate business that could compete for contracts and protect worker owners from personal liability. The second challenge was insurance. Construction companies required comprehensive liability coverage, workers' compensation insurance, and bonding that guaranteed contract completion. The cooperative structure made some insurance companies reluctant to provide coverage, but I eventually found insurers who specialized in alternative business models and understood the reduced risks that came from worker ownership. The third challenge was building the initial team of worker owners. I approached Uncle James first, explaining the cooperative concept and asking whether he would be willing to leave Peterson Construction to help start something unprecedented. His initial reaction was skepticism. He had been conditioned to believe that stable employment, even exploitative employment, was preferable to the risks of entrepreneurship. But as I explained the business plan, the financial projections, and the democratic structure that would give him control over his working conditions and compensation, Uncle James began to understand that the cooperative offered not just better wages, but dignity and security that were impossible under traditional employment models. "Damon," he said, after studying the business plan for several hours, "this sounds too good to be true. Workers don't own businesses. Businesses own workers. How do I know this isn't just another way for someone to take advantage of people like me?" "Because," I replied, "you'll be an owner, not an employee. You'll vote on every major decision, share in every profit, and have the same rights as everyone else in the cooperative. No one can exploit you because you'll be exploiting yourself, and no one steals from themselves." Uncle James agreed to join the cooperative, but only after I had recruited several other experienced workers who could ensure that the business would have the expertise necessary for success. The most important recruit was Miguel Santos, a master electrician who had worked for various construction companies and had become frustrated with the exploitative practices that were standard in the industry. Miguel brought not only technical expertise but also credibility with other skilled workers who were essential for building a complete construction team. Through his network, I was able to recruit Carlos Rodriguez, a plumber with 15 years of experience, and David Kim, a carpenter who specialized in custom residential work. Each worker I recruited required extensive conversations about the cooperative model, the business plan, and the risks and rewards of worker ownership. Most had never heard of worker cooperatives and were initially skeptical about whether such businesses could succeed in competitive markets. But as I explained how their current employers extracted value from their labor while providing minimal compensation and security, and how the cooperative would allow them to capture the full value of their work while sharing risks and rewards equally, they began to understand the potential for economic empowerment that worker ownership represented. With 48 hours of nonstop work, I had created something that could change not just my uncle's life, but the lives of every worker being exploited by people like his boss. The confrontation with Peterson wasn't dramatic or violent. It was quiet and dignified, the kind of resignation that comes from having alternatives rather than accepting exploitation as inevitable. Uncle James walked into Peterson's office on Monday morning with a formal resignation letter and 2 weeks' notice, prepared to finish his current projects professionally while transitioning to work that would provide dignity rather than desperation. Peterson's reaction revealed everything about his character and his business model. Instead of expressing appreciation for Uncle James's years of service or wishing him success in his new venture, Peterson became angry and accusatory, demanding to know why Uncle James was abandoning the company and threatening to make it difficult for him to find work elsewhere. "You're making a mistake, James," Peterson said, his voice carrying the kind of threat that had kept workers compliant for years. "You'll never find another job that pays as well as this one, and I'll make sure that other contractors know you're unreliable." But Uncle James had something he had never had before: alternatives. The cooperative was ready to begin operations, contracts were lined up, and his economic security no longer depended on Peterson's goodwill or threats. "Mr. Peterson?" Uncle James replied, his voice steady and confident for the first time in years. "I appreciate the opportunity you gave me to work here, but I found a situation that's better for my family and my future. I'll finish my current projects professionally, and I wish you success with your business." Peterson's threats had no power over someone who was no longer dependent on his employment, and Uncle James's calm professionalism made Peterson's anger look petty and unprofessional by comparison. The transition from Peterson Construction to the cooperative was smoother than anyone had anticipated. Uncle James completed his remaining projects, trained his replacement, and left Peterson's company with his reputation intact and his dignity restored. But the most powerful moment came when Uncle James called his children to tell them that he would be coming home for dinner at regular hours, that paychecks would be reliable and sufficient, and that he would never again have to beg anyone for money he had already earned through honest work. My uncle walked into his boss's office for the last time, not to beg, but to resign with his dignity intact. What would you build to restore your family's dignity? When does watching injustice become participating in it through silence? Have you ever witnessed exploitation so systematic that you realized individual complaints were inadequate, and only alternative systems could create meaningful change? These weren't abstract questions anymore. They were the realities I had lived through, the choices I had made, and the lessons I carried forward into a completely different understanding of what was possible when economic alternatives replaced economic dependence. The success of the construction cooperative exceeded every projection in our business plan. Within 6 months, we had completed 12 major projects, hired 8 additional worker owners, and generated profits that were distributed equally among all members. But the most meaningful success was the transformation in the lives of workers who had experienced dignity and security for the first time in their careers. Uncle James's family life was transformed immediately. Regular paychecks and reasonable working hours allowed him to be present for his children's activities and engaged in their education. The stress and anxiety that had dominated his personality for years began to fade as economic security replaced constant financial crisis. Michael no longer needed to work part-time to help with family expenses, was able to focus on his studies, and began exploring college opportunities that had seemed impossible when the family was struggling to meet basic needs. His grades improved dramatically, and he started talking about career goals that went beyond immediate survival. Sarah was able to participate in extracurricular activities and social opportunities that had been financially impossible. Her responsibilities for childcare decreased as Uncle James's work schedule became more predictable, allowing her to experience normal childhood activities and relationships. Little Tony began to understand that life could be stable and secure, that adults could provide reliable care and protection, and that families could make plans for the future rather than just surviving day by day. But the transformation extended beyond Uncle James's immediate family to the entire community of workers who had joined the cooperative. Miguel Santos was able to purchase a house for the first time in his life, using profits from cooperative membership as a down payment. Carlos Rodriguez started a college fund for his daughter, confident that consistent income and profit sharing would allow him to provide educational opportunities that previous jobs had made impossible. David Kim began offering carpentry classes to teenagers in the community, sharing skills and knowledge that could lead to careers in construction while also building the next generation of worker owners who could continue expanding the cooperative model. The cooperative's success began attracting attention from workers at other construction companies who were interested in joining or starting similar ventures. We received inquiries from roofers, landscapers, painters, and other skilled trades workers who wanted to escape exploitative employment relationships and build businesses that shared profits with workers rather than extracting them. His children never had to watch their father beg again because I had learned that the best revenge against a system is making it irrelevant. The impact of our cooperative's success extended beyond our immediate members to the broader construction industry in our region. Companies like Peterson Construction began to face labor shortages as skilled workers learned about alternatives that provided better compensation, working conditions, and respect for their contributions. Peterson himself was forced to improve wages and working conditions in order to retain workers who were increasingly aware that they had choices. The competitive pressure from worker-owned businesses created market incentives for traditional employers to treat workers more fairly, benefiting even those who remained in conventional employment relationships. Within a year, 3 additional worker-owned cooperatives had been started by former employees of exploitative construction companies. The model was being replicated and adapted by different groups of skilled workers who were discovering that they could organize successful businesses without surrendering control to outside investors or exploitative employers. The legal and financial structures we had developed for our cooperative became templates that other groups could use to start their own worker-owned businesses. We began offering consulting services to help workers navigate the complex process of transitioning from employment to ownership, sharing knowledge and resources that made cooperative development more accessible to people without business backgrounds. But the most important impact was cultural rather than economic. The success of worker-owned cooperatives was changing how people in our community thought about work, ownership, and economic relationships. Instead of accepting that workers would always be subordinate to employers, people were beginning to understand that democratic ownership and shared profits were viable alternatives to traditional business models. The cooperative movement in our region began attracting attention from universities, policymakers, and economic development organizations who were interested in understanding how worker ownership could address persistent problems of inequality, economic insecurity, and community development. I was invited to speak at conferences about cooperative development, to consult with other communities that wanted to replicate our model, and to participate in research about the economic and social impacts of worker ownership. But the most meaningful recognition came from Uncle James and the other worker owners who had discovered that dignity and security were achievable through economic empowerment rather than charity or government assistance. 2 years after watching Uncle James beg his boss for a week's pay, I was invited to testify before a state legislative committee about the role that worker-owned cooperatives could play in addressing wage theft, workplace exploitation, and economic inequality in the construction industry. Representatives, I began. 2 years ago, I watched my uncle, a skilled construction foreman with 20 years of experience, beg his employer for money he had already earned because his children hadn't eaten a real meal in 4 days. That moment taught me that individual complaints about workplace exploitation are inadequate when the problem is systematic. I presented research about the prevalence of wage theft in construction, statistics about workplace injuries and fatalities that resulted from pressure to cut costs through reduced safety measures, and examples of how worker-owned cooperatives had created alternatives that addressed these problems through democratic ownership and shared responsibility. The most important lesson we learned, I explained, is that workers don't need protection from exploitation. They need alternatives to exploitation. Worker-owned cooperatives demonstrate that businesses can be profitable while treating workers as partners rather than resources, that economic security can be achieved through shared ownership rather than individual competition. I outlined policy recommendations for supporting cooperative development through favorable tax treatment, access to capital, and procurement preferences for businesses that shared profits with workers, rather than extracting them for outside investors. Economic development isn't about attracting businesses that exploit local workers, I concluded. It's about supporting local workers to create businesses that serve their communities, while providing dignity and security for the people who do the actual work. The committee received my testimony with serious attention, but the conversation that meant the most came afterward, when a representative approached me privately. "My brother works construction," she said. "He's been complaining about his employer for years, but he doesn't think he has any alternatives. After hearing your testimony, I want to learn more about how worker cooperatives get started." That conversation reminded me that workplace exploitation affects families across every community, that the solutions we had developed for Uncle James could work for other workers facing similar challenges, and that systematic change happens through accumulation of individual alternatives that prove better approaches are possible. 3 years after that devastating scene in Peterson's construction trailer, Uncle James and I were invited to speak at the annual conference of the National Cooperative Business Association about our experience developing a worker-owned construction cooperative. Standing at that podium together, uncle and nephew who had transformed crisis into opportunity, I felt proud not just of our business success, but of the dignity that economic empowerment had restored to Uncle James and his family. 3 years ago, Uncle James told the audience, I was a skilled foreman who had to beg my boss for money I had already earned because my children were hungry. I thought that was just how construction work was, that workers like me would always be at the mercy of employers who could decide whether we deserved basic dignity. He looked at me. My nephew taught me that workers don't have to accept exploitation, that we can create our own businesses, that we can capture the full value of our labor while sharing risks and rewards with people we respect and trust. When it was my turn to speak, I talked about the difference between charity and empowerment, between individual solutions and systematic change, between accepting economic relationships as natural rather than recognizing them as choices that could be made differently. The most important thing I learned, I said, is that the best way to fight exploitation isn't to reform exploitative businesses, it's to create alternatives that make exploitation irrelevant. When workers have choices, they don't have to accept abuse. When workers own businesses, they don't have to beg for dignity. The standing ovation that followed wasn't just recognition of our presentation, it was acknowledgement that workplace exploitation requires both individual alternatives and systematic change, that worker-owned cooperatives weren't just business models, but expressions of values about economic democracy and shared prosperity. 4 years after watching Uncle James's dignity being destroyed by an exploitative employer, I graduated from State University with degrees in economics and cooperative business development, having completed my education while continuing to manage the construction cooperative that had grown to employ 37 worker owners and had inspired similar ventures throughout our region. But the moment that brought everything full circle came during my graduation ceremony, when Uncle James stood up in the audience, confident, prosperous, and secure in ways that had seemed impossible when he was begging Peterson for early payment, and cheered loud enough for everyone to hear when my name was called. After the ceremony, we celebrated with a family dinner that included all the worker owners from our cooperative and their families. The same kitchen where Uncle James had once worried about feeding his children was now filled with stories of successful projects, shared profits, and young people who were learning that work could provide dignity rather than desperation. The cooperative had grown into a regional business that employed 43 worker owners, had completed over 200 projects, and had inspired the creation of 17 other worker-owned cooperatives in industries ranging from landscaping to electrical work. But the achievement I was most proud of wasn't business expansion. It was the knowledge that Uncle James's humiliation had become the foundation for proving that workers deserved ownership, respect, and economic security. What Damon built, Uncle James said during a toast at our celebration dinner, wasn't just a business. It was proof that workers don't have to beg for dignity, that we can create our own opportunities, and that the best revenge against exploitation is making it irrelevant through economic alternatives. 5 years after that scene in Peterson's construction trailer, I was invited to address the graduating class of the State University's business school. Standing at that podium, looking out at students who would spend their careers developing economic solutions to complex problems, I thought about the journey that had brought me from witnessing workplace exploitation to creating economic alternatives that served human dignity. 5 years ago, I told them, I watched my uncle beg his employer for money he had already earned, and I realized that individual complaints about systematic problems are inadequate. The most effective response to exploitation isn't reform, it's replacement. I talked about the importance of understanding that business models are choices rather than natural laws, that economic relationships can be organized to serve workers rather than exploit them, and that young entrepreneurs have opportunities to create alternatives that established businesses are unwilling or unable to provide. Some of you will build businesses that generate wealth for investors, I continued. Some of you will develop technologies that change industries. Some of you will create innovations that solve problems people didn't even know could be solved. I looked out at faces that represented the next generation of business leaders, people who would determine whether economic systems continued to exploit workers or began to serve human dignity and community development. What I want you to remember, I concluded, is that the most revolutionary thing you can do isn't necessarily the most dramatic or attention-getting thing. Sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is prove that workers don't have to beg for dignity. They can build it themselves through democratic ownership and shared prosperity. The applause was generous, but the moment that mattered most came afterward, when a student named Maria approached me with her father, both of them with tears in their eyes. My father works in a restaurant where the owner steals tips and delays paychecks, she said. Our family has been trying to figure out what to do, but we didn't know there were alternatives to traditional employment. After hearing your speech, I think we might be able to start something better. I looked at Maria and saw myself 5 years earlier, young, angry about injustice, convinced that individual complaints were inadequate but unsure about what systematic alternatives might look like. There are always alternatives to exploitation, I told her. The question is whether you're ready to build them. If you believe that workers deserve dignity rather than desperation, that economic relationships can serve human development rather than just profit extraction, and that the most revolutionary response to systematic exploitation is creating systematic alternatives, then this story matters to you too. Subscribe for more stories about young people who refuse to watch their families accept exploitation. who learned that the best revenge against broken systems is making them irrelevant through economic innovation, and who discovered that the most important question isn't how to reform bad employers, but how to create good alternatives. Because that scene in Peterson's construction trailer, watching Uncle James beg for money he had already earned, taught me something no classroom ever could. That workplace exploitation requires both individual courage and collective alternatives, that dignity can't be granted by employers but must be built by workers, and that the most powerful weapon against systematic oppression is systematic alternatives that prove better approaches are possible. Hit that subscribe button if you believe that work should provide dignity rather than desperation, that businesses should serve workers rather than exploit them, and that sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is prove that begging is unnecessary when building is possible. Because sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is prove that workers don't have to beg for dignity. They can build it themselves. And sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone you love isn't protection from exploitation, but proof that exploitation can be made irrelevant through economic alternatives that treat workers as partners rather than resources, as owners rather than employees, as human beings deserving of respect rather than objects deserving of control. Uncle James never had to beg again, because I learned that the best revenge against a system that breaks people's dignity is building a system that restores it. The most shocking thing about our construction cooperative wasn't that it succeeded financially. It was that it proved workers could own successful businesses, make democratic decisions, and share profits without outside investors or exploitative employers. The trailer where Uncle James once begged Peterson for early payment still sits on construction sites around our region. But now it represents something different. Not the place where workers go to plead for basic dignity, but a reminder that alternatives exist for people brave enough to build them, smart enough to organize them, and determined enough to prove that economic democracy isn't just a theory, but a practice that works when people decide that their dignity is worth more than their desperation.